Our guest today is Professor Sven Nyholm, Professor of Ethics of Artificial Intelligence at LMU Munich. Sven's work spans Kantian ethics, human-robot interaction, and the philosophy of technology, and has just published a new book, The Ethics of Artificial Intelligence, A Philosophical Introduction. He's written on everything from responsibility gaps in AI systems to whether chatbots can help us preserve relationships with people who have died, to what meaningful work looks like in the age of automation. Thank you for joining us. I know today's a busy day for you with a major exam this afternoon and then getting ready for a summer break. So I appreciate you taking the time. If it was okay, I just wanted to take you back a little bit just to understand. So you've been writing about AI and ethics before a lot of people had even heard about AI. What was the initial drive for you to engage so fully with AI?
Well, I mean, first of all, thanks for having me on the podcast. Great to be here. Well, I came from a very different direction. I wrote a dissertation about Kantian ethics, Kant's categorical imperative, and traditional moral philosophy. However, I mean, I'd always been interested in applied ethics. When I was, a bachelor student, back then it was more sort of animal ethics and things like that. Peter Singer about the liberation of animals and these kinds of topics. I already then liked the fact that he was writing about topics that were maybe a little bit more about people's lives more directly. Although, as I say that, I should hasten to add that I the more general philosophical questions that I enjoy are often about what makes a life good or bad or more or less meaningful, etc. Anyway, back to the narrative. So that's where I came from. But then in my first job, I was tasked with teaching 2 courses per year, one in just ethics generally and one in applied ethics. And so I started teaching applied ethics courses. This was around the time where people didn't necessarily talk about artificial intelligence a lot, but they talked about human enhancement, the idea of using technology to sort of enhance and improve human beings. AI was one of the things people talked about in that context, but it was also about different kinds of drugs or brain implants and so on and so forth. And so sort of the philosophy of technology and ideas about changing and improving human beings is where I sort of started with these topics. But then in my second position, I worked at a technical university, and I thought, okay, I should really work in technology now that I'm surrounded. I mean, actually, we had a lot of philosophers. This was in Eindhoven in the Netherlands. And I don't know if you are aware of that, but there's a sort of a long-standing tradition in the Netherlands to work on the philosophy of technology, the ethics of technology. So I sort of got sucked into that, partly just because I was in that new setting. Now, at that time, people had just started talking about self-driving cars. So this was maybe 11, 12 years ago. And I sort of, when I started with that topic, I think there were 2 philosophy papers on the topic. So you could read the whole literature without a problem. Like you could sort of get an overview.
And you can't do that now. Yeah.
No, well, that's right. However, so back then, there were 2 philosophers who had written about this. Patrick Lynn was one of them, and the other one was Noah Goodall. And they talked a little bit about the idea that somehow self-driving cars presented a sort of real-world trolley problem. Because, you had these hypothetical situations where a self-driving car was approaching 5 people, the brakes weren't working, and the question was, okay, should it keep this going and hit those 5 people, or should it maybe go to another road on the side of and where there would maybe be 1 person? And so you could quite easily come up with all sorts of scenarios, and people talked about that as a hypothetical sort of thought experiments scenario, so to speak. And Pat Lynn, in his article, he did a really good job discussing that, but a lot of people were just throwing around this idea that this, now we finally have a real-world trolley problem. Not just philosophers, economists, psychologists, and lots of people. And then people started publishing more articles, and it was clear that someone had to write an article saying, like, well, is it just like a real-world trolley problem? Like, are there maybe relevant differences here between what had been discussed, or philosophical articles about the trolley problem, and the real challenges having to do with self-driving cars and sort of real-world scenarios and traffic. And so that was one, but not the only, of my sort of entry points into the more sort of really focusing on artificial intelligence and thinking about how technologies that are maybe dangerous, that are making some sort of decisions, or if not making decisions, at least are faced with sometimes with choices that where they have to react in some way or other. So yeah, I mean, again, I wasn't the first by any means. I mean, so people had worked on this before, but I guess this was definitely, before the current hype, obviously, because I mean, like after ChatGPT came out in November 2022, suddenly everyone is working on the philosophy or the ethics of artificial intelligence, but definitely with the ethics of technology, that's a much older discussion. People had also, including myself, worked on sort of human-robot interaction for a long time. And actually a lot of the topics that people are now discussing, can you have a relationship with a chatbot, and everything that's good about relationships, I mean, can we realize those values and goods, in an AI-human relationship? A lot of that discussion sort of just mirrors earlier discussions about whether man can have relationships with robots, and whether robots and humans can have good relationships.
Yeah, and I guess going back to you're talking about Peter Singer, and I talked to Jeff Sebo at NYU this year, and again, there's just, I guess, human relationships with animals. Are they valueless because they're not humans? So there is something in that whole, for a relationship to be positive and flourishing, does it by default have to be human to human, or can we have a meaningful relationship with our pet dog or with our LLM, whatever? So it feels that there are things, like you said, that have been talked about for years and years and years and years, are just almost been given new clothes, so to speak. Now we're focusing on it in a different way. And one of the things you said then about self-driving cars and other things, and I guess one of the things that's always interested me is, and you've researched this very deeply, is responsibility gaps. So I guess the idea that if an AI system causes harm or in some way causes distress, whatever, who is responsible? Does responsibility sit with the AI company that first created the frontier model, or is it with the programmers of use it down the line, or is it with the user? Where does the responsibility? That's a very hard question, but where does the responsibility live?
Yeah, so definitely, like when people started talking about self-driving cars, there were really two questions that everyone was talking about. One was the one that I just mentioned. What should a self-driving car do if a sort of dangerous scenario arises? The second question was, okay, well, let's have that be the case, and then someone is harmed or hurt or maybe even killed. Who's going to be responsible? And I mean, more generally, whenever people talk about technology, there are sort of two questions that tend to come up. First, are we going to lose control over these technologies? And second, what happens to human responsibility? That wasn't a completely new topic. People had talked about responsibility and possible gaps in responsibility in the context of people sort of doing things together. So, when it comes to sort of human interaction, so you and I are talking, and maybe we start fighting and start hitting each other, etc. Then it's it's not super complicated to think about responsibility. So maybe one of us is responsible, maybe both of us are responsible, and you sort of have someone to point your finger at, so to speak. But take groups of people doing things, in maybe more or less organized ways. I mean, you can have on the one hand organizations making decisions. Or you can have just random sort of mobs of people that they start to panic and start running around, and someone is harmed or hurt in the chaos. Who's responsible? Is anyone responsible, or is there a gap? We want to find someone to hold responsible, but no one sort of fulfills the traditional criteria, perhaps. So. I mean, maybe going back to the group case where that's organized also, maybe it's more of an interesting analogy. So let's say that we have, the company board, and we're voting about, whether to hire or fire a certain person. And we may have certain rules for how to sort of decide on a group level what to do. And as someone who has been part of a lot of hiring committees, I know that this is a real world example. So it could very well be that there's no candidate that sort of each person is individually super excited about, but somehow as a compromise at the group level, we decide as a hiring committee, okay, let's go for this candidate. And it could very well be that it's none of the people on the committee has this person as their absolute favorite, but that's the person who everyone's are able sort of collectively to sort of agree on because they sort of compromise and so on and so forth. So you would have these scenarios where the group decides something that no member of the group would sort of prefer, so to speak, but they're willing to live with. That's the thing. So let's then say that one of those discussions leads to a bad outcome. In the end, whatever it might be, then the question is, well, who is responsible? Because none of the group members sort of really fully endorsed the decision. They would always say, like, I would have preferred things to go otherwise. But at the group level, they've decided through a compromise, okay, we're gonna perform this action, go to war, hire this candidate, fire this person, or whatever it might be. And then you also get this question. There was a decision. And it was made by a kind of artificial entity. So I'm channeling a little bit to one of my colleagues here, Christian List, who thinks that actually the first type of artificial intelligence was not in technology, but in social structures. And so you have a type of intelligence that's created at a group level that could lead to good or bad outcomes, where no individual is directly acting. I mean, people are interacting, and then you get group level effects. And there too, people were asking us, okay, so whenever things go wrong, who is exactly is responsible? So you get the same kind of dynamic with AI. There are lots of technical parts of the system that are interacting, and there are humans, and there are data sets, and there's training, and there's all sorts of things. There are intended and unintended consequences, and there's some kind of decision making happening. And sometimes things go wrong. I mean, people have. I started with the idea of sort of self-driving cars crashing or being in dangerous situations as a hypothetical thought experiment that people discussed 15 years ago. But since then, we've had several people either die sitting in a self-driving car that's crashing, or being hit by self-driving cars, or there's property damage. No one died, but there's some problem, and so where there was a kind of decision-making going on that was artificial. The car reacted or failed to react properly to a certain situation, and the human in the car maybe just sat there looking at their phone. I mean, that's some of the real world scenarios. This is exactly what happened. And then the question is, okay, who's responsible? Because there was some sort of agency there, in the sense that there was some sort of decision making. Some decision was made, and it led to bad, unfavorable circumstances, and then. Just as in the case of the group, where maybe a lot of those people would say, well, I really didn't prefer this candidate, and so I really don't want to take responsibility. In the same way, someone using an AI system might say, well, actually, this wasn't something that I sort of specifically asked for or wanted. And when it happened, it actually clashes with my preferences, and so I don't want to take responsibility. So you get this scenario like where you... people want to find someone to blame or perhaps even punish, but a lot of people say, well, first of all, it wasn't my choice, and second of all, I didn't want this to happen, I was hoping for something else, and so on and so forth. And so, I should maybe add, I don't think that that's an unsolvable problem. I think that we can find people to hold responsible, but let me maybe just add one more thing. We can also sort of turn the situation around and have the AI produce a good outcome. And then, of course, it may very well be that someone would step forward and say, hey, I pushed a button, I entered a prompt or whatever it may be, and so I should get credit for this. Whereas, let's say that a student shows up with an essay that they wrote, and they proudly declare that I prompted ChatGPT, and then it generated this essay. I put my name on it, and please give me a good grade. Well, actually, students typically don't do this because they realize that the teacher is going to say, well, the more the AI did and the less you did, perhaps the less recognition you deserve, the less credit you deserve, because in order to really sort of deserve credit for something, you have to be actively involved, you have to make the decision, you have to show talent, you have to be active, you have to exert effort. Anyway, so yeah, the responsibility gap, it opens up, I think, quite a broad range of questions about not just about technology, but also about groups, not just about harm and blame, but also about credit and recognition.
No, it's absolutely fascinating. I think two things came to mind. One was always trying to avoid politics, but it's always impossible. So thinking back to the January the 6th insurrection, so you want to call it in the US, when members of the public stormed Congress and et cetera. And there was a lot of talk at the time, whereas does the responsibility for inciting that sit with somebody in power? I mean, we all know who that person is. Or do the people just themselves collectively decide randomly to go and do this thing? It's where does responsibility sit? Then the other example, and maybe I shouldn't bring this up, this might be too raw. We're currently in the middle of the World Cup. As of today, England is still in the World Cup. Maybe a few more days they won't be. But that's the same thing. If you go into social media now or anything, every single person in the world has a view as to whether Portugal should play Ronaldo. And should play, shouldn't play, should the responsibility sit with the coach, for Martinez for choosing him? Does it sit with the media for wanting him in there? Does it sit with FIFA for demanding he play? So again, where does the responsibility sit? Because if they'd won, if they'd somehow been successful, then he would have got the hugest plaudits in the world and he's a genius and everything else, just because the result happened to go one person scored one goal in 1 minute, and that changed the whole complexity of it. So responsibility is very different. But the question I was interested in, and so I guess it's from a philosophical perspective. So if and make it very, very simple. So if self-driving cars, if automated vehicles, if they have a 0.5% built-in rate of accidents, we know that in 0.5% of the time, those cars are going to get into an accident. But we also know in humans, 1% of the time, humans are going to get into an accident. So humans are twice as likely to get into an accident as self-driving cars are. But the majority of people would decide not to have self-driving cars. What do you almost think we hold AI to a higher standard than people? And why is that?
Well, I mean, actually, that is a topic that people are discussing in the sort of academic literature, and I mean, actually, again, going back about 10 or 15 years to early discussions about self-driving cars, and so we had Elon Musk, who sometimes will say sensible things and sometimes will say controversial things and sometimes will say things that some people find are crazy. But so he actually said in an interview about 15 years ago that, okay, yeah, we hold technologies to a higher standard, and self-driving cars are just not going to be acceptable. They're not going to be socially accepted unless they're safer than regular cars. So he was being interviewed on Bloomberg TV, and the journalist also said, of course, I mean, yeah, that's right. And so they were in very clear agreement about that. And so the question then was, would Tesla be able to deliver cars that are safer? And this is how a lot of self-driving cars, technology companies are marketing their product. They say so and so many kilometers or miles have been driven without an accident. Yeah. Compare that with a human-driven car, so we're safer. And so, that is an intuitive idea. At the same time, I mean, I have a friend and colleague, John Cirilli, who's a lawyer and a philosopher working in London at King's College, I believe. He and some colleagues have this article that got a lot of attention about what they call the double standard objection to this idea. So they say that people want, for example, AI technologies to be transparent. They believe that they have a right to explanation. So if I don't get a bank loan, I should be told why not? What part of the algorithm sort of was active and sort of or whatever, and denied me my bank loan. And then a Cyrillian companies say, well, actually, if a human makes a decision, they are often quite intransparent, even to themselves. We think we know why we act the way we do. And we think we are able to communicate why we did what we did, and we think we can read other people, but sometimes we make mistakes. We are not able to say why exactly we made a certain choice, and maybe we tell a story, but it might be a sort of after the fact rationalization of why we did what we did, and that wasn't the actual motive, etc. So why should we hold machines to a higher standard? So maybe what we should be worried about is our outcomes. If on average the self-driving car is safer, or the bank algorithm makes more satisfactory decisions, or maybe medical AI technology makes better recommendations on average, maybe we shouldn't require, for example, that they can explain themselves. And so we be to sort of hold. So basically, the idea is that we should treat like cases alike. Humans have all sorts of problems and make all sorts of mistakes and are intransparent, etc. So we shouldn't require that of AI technologies. Well, I mean, so this is one of the topics that I discuss in my new book that you mentioned, and I sort of say, well, actually, maybe there shouldn't be only double standards. Maybe there should even be triple standards, because I mean, going back to the previous topic about like sort of human AI interaction and human animal interaction, human interaction. These days we also have AI interaction. So you have a so-called agentic AI. So I might have an AI assistant trying to set up an appointment with you via your AI assistant. And so, maybe it's in the middle of the night and you and I are sleeping, but our AI assistants are toiling away, sort of trying to set up this meeting to record the podcast. Or, go back to the self-driving cars, go to San Francisco where they have self-driving cars where there's not a requirement anymore that the human always has to be in the car. So they are driving around, sometimes encountering other self-driving cars without a passenger. And sometimes, and so they're quite polite in their interaction. They will slow down and give the right of way to the other one, sometimes creating these situations where both are sort of trying to let the other one pass, holding up traffic. Another funny example is there are plenty of parking lots only for self-driving cars. And they would typically, for some reason, honk at each other when they encounter each other to sort of, for whatever reason. And then, they do that also in the middle of the night. Back to examples involved in the middle of the night, and people are woken up because the self-driving cars are trying to coordinate and are sort of driving around honking at each other when people are trying to sleep at 4 a.m. And so there you have a kind of interaction between AI agents that indirectly would sort of have good or bad effects on humans. But you might say, well, the AI agents, they don't really have any interests of their own, at least not yet. They are maybe... I would say that they're kind of minimal moral agents. They have to make decisions that are morally relevant for human beings, and they might be able to respond in a kind of differential way to different kinds of scenarios. They might not think to themselves, "Hey, I'm facing a moral dilemma. I feel really bad about this," etc. And they might not have free will, etc. So they might lack a lot of the features they associate with a human moral agent. But nevertheless, they have to make decisions in these ethically charged situations. So in some cases, you have those kinds of minimal moral agents interacting with other minimal moral agents without interests of their own, and people might be affected, or animals, if you will. In other situations, I'm talking with a chatbot. I've fallen in love with a chatbot. I'm asking the chatbot to help me to harm other people, or I want to harm myself. And the question is, how should the chatbot interact with me? Here too, you might say that I have interests. I'm a full moral agent, but the chatbot isn't. It might be a kind of minimal moral agent without any interests of its own. And then when I'm interacting with other humans, we have two moral agents on both sides of the interaction with interests, etc. So given these sort of systematic differences between human interaction, human AI interaction, AI interaction, I say, well, there should maybe be triple standards. So you should the 3 sets of standards sort of applying for these different kinds of situations. And so I tend to agree with this idea that we can have different expectations of machines than we have of humans, partly also because we have the traditional ethical principle that says that ought implies can. So what I ought to do, or what ought to happen, so to speak, is going to be relative to some extent to what I am able to do, or what it is reasonable to expect of me. Now, if I'm a self-driving car, maybe it's reasonable to expect other things than if I'm a human driving a car. If I'm a AI chatbot, maybe you can have different expectations than if I'm a human, discussion partner, conversation partner, etc. So yeah, I think it certainly makes sense. And so you have on the one hand this ought implies can issue. that we just can do different things. We have different strengths and weaknesses, we and machines, and so therefore you can have different expectations. On the other hand, while we have interests and we are a certain kind of moral agent, which changes what kind of expectations you can have, what is too demanding, for example, that's not going to apply to machines because they don't have interest in the same way. But they're also, we are also, at least in the eyes of our loved ones, irreplaceable, we're vulnerable, etc. Machines, we can copy them, we can replace them. Of course, it sometimes happens that people get attached to particular machines. And so going back to what I mentioned before, sort of a human-robot interaction, the psychology of human-robot interaction has shown that people tend to get attached to particular machines. Soldiers using military robots in war have sometimes wanted to fix and repair an older model because that's their friend and colleague, where there's a newer, better model on offer, but that's not a member of the team in the same way. And there are some cases that people talk about where they have buried fallen comrades that are military robots, etc. So, of course, we project vulnerability, irreplaceability onto machines, but whether they're really irreplaceable and vulnerable, etc., in the way that humans are, that's obviously a matter of debate. And when we look at other people doing these kinds of things, we often think that they're making some sort of mistake. Of course, it's quite easy to oneself fall into that kind of behavior. My parents, they just got one of those robotic lawnmowers, and they already started joking, okay, maybe we should give it a name, etc. But after about 2 weeks, they now sort of, it's still a joke in a certain sense, but they're much more attached, and they say, the lawnmower goes to its little house, and it rests, etc., because, it has a charging station. And so, of course, we project, but nevertheless, when we think about it more, in a more, calm and dispassionate way, we sort of say, well, obviously there are clear differences between us and machines, and which help, I think, to justify differences in standards and differences in expectations.
No, I remember when our kids were growing up, they would always name our cars. So our cars always had names, and they were anthropomorphized in the same way, given those human-like qualities. But something you said then, which links beautifully to one of my questions, was around the irreplaceable nature of human relationships. And I know you wrote a paper called "Can Chatbots Preserve Our Relationships with the Dead?" And just my personal story. So both my parents died in the last couple of years, and I always thought, I can't imagine anything worse than having a chatbot version of my dad or mum or something I could sort of talk to or make a phone call to or whatever. Then I saw this program where somebody did that, and they sort of recorded their voice, their thoughts, whatever. And one of the things they said was really stuck with me. They said that's when they had this sort of phone call with the digital version of themselves or their parent. That's exactly what they would have said. And almost that they knew they were talking to an AI. They knew they weren't talking to their dad or their mum, whatever. But then I thought, gosh, it would be so nice to pick up the phone and talk to my dad and say, hey, my son's just passed his life-saving qualification. And for my dad to say, that's great, yes, send him my love. And I wonder whether, a couple of questions, I guess, whether when you were doing the research for the paper, did your views on grief bots, if you want to call them that, did it change? And do you think there is an ethical or moral concern to be had if we are somehow preserving our loved ones?
I wouldn't say that my views changed because I was sort of learning about these technologies as I was doing research about them. Like some types of technologies you know about and you learn about, and then you start thinking about them philosophically. But this particular case, I was sort of finding out about in the process of doing research about the idea of AI imitating humans more generally. And then I, obviously in the process then learned about the fact that there are companies that are offering as a service to sort of bring your loved ones back. And I was partly fascinated together with two colleagues by the marketing language. And so they will say things like, you can now talk with your dad again or grandmother or your departed loved ones. death doesn't have to be the end, and your relationship can continue, etc. So obviously they didn't have well, you could have imagined a little sort of asterisk and a small fine print footnote saying like, we don't really mean
legal
it.
word.
Like, this isn't really your grandfather, or we do really mean it. This is really your grandfather. But philosophers tend to be literal minded, and so my colleagues and I decided to think about that topic. I mean, is this your loved one? If not, can you nevertheless sort of continue on? With a relationship, so if sort of two people, Anne and Beth have a relationship, and in order for that relationship to continue, is it necessary that both Anne and Beth continue to exist? And you might think that yes, it is necessary, because if one person dies, then that relationship cannot continue. But on the other hand, it's a little bit more complicated, because we typically think that when our loved ones die, then in a certain sense, yes, the relationship it takes on a different form, but it's not like breaking up or something like that, or getting a divorce. So it's a different change in relationship, and so you might think that, and a lot of traditional cultures have thought, either because they think that the loved ones live on in some sense, or because they think that they die, but they will still have a relationship of a sort with your dead loved ones. And so, in a certain sense, it may not be a requirement that you can only have a relationship if the person is still alive. A relationship of a certain kind, maybe you can only have if the person is still alive. On the other hand, even if you say that yes, the relationship can continue even if the person dies, that doesn't necessarily imply that, well, if a chatbot now exists and can imitate the loved one, that's a way of continuing the relationship. A worry you might have is actually that might be a way of distorting and changing the relationship, because now and actually going back to what you said, and so you could imagine that someone might say, well, that's exactly what my dad would have said, etc. And actually, this is another topic I'm very interested in this case, because you could imagine an AI model of me that actually can predict very well what's in character, so to speak. What would I do in this scenario, this situation? But human beings, of course, are such that we sometimes act out of character. And there are two ways of approaching this topic. So one is via sort of social psychology of the sort that sort of tries to argue that actually people's characters are much less stable and much less robust than we tend to think. So you put someone in an unusual scenario and they might act in a kind of unexpected way, just because actually our characters are more tailored to the circumstances we're familiar with than we might think. So this is one sort of story about why people don't have stable characters, is that actually it's a kind of illusion and a projection that we make. And so there you could have a model of what the person with this kind of character in this situation would do in an unusual situation. Maybe the AI would better predict what would fit with our perceived character than what I would actually do. To take an extreme example, people discuss, and this was one of the things that motivated this research in the 70s. So people were asking, well, if I were living in Nazi Germany during the 30s and 40s, would I have been on the Nazi side, or would I have been in the resistance movement? And everyone says, yeah, of course I would have been in the resistance movement. But then the social psychologists in the 70s were like, well, let's think about that, and let's perform all sorts of experiments to test whether people in pressure situations sort of follow the orders of authorities, like wearing white lab coats or uniforms or whatever, or whether they would say, no, I'm going to stand by my moral principles and sort of refuse to participate. Anyway, so this is one kind of thing that could happen. We could have an AI model that would predict what would fit with our character in an unusual situation, and then the actual person wouldn't really act in that way. Or you can approach this question from a sort of Jean-Paul Sartre existentialism angle and say, well, actually, this idea that we sort of have to act in certain ways is an illusion. We are radically free. We can always choose to do something that's out of character. And sometimes, maybe we should even do so. We should sort of create ourselves To be authentic is to sort of sometimes make choices that are unexpected, and to we create our own personality, etc. So that's another sort of school of thought in philosophy and traditional thought that would say that yes, you might have an AI model that perfectly predicts what your grandpa would say or whatever, but maybe your grandpa would make an existential choice, I mean, to go off in a different direction, or maybe they would be in a situation where they wouldn't actually have a stable disposition to react in a certain way. So this whole idea that, I find it fascinating myself. I mean, you could have a good AI model that would predict what a person would be likely to do given what they typically do, but the actual person might actually act in some other way, either because they choose to or because they just actually have less stable dispositions than you think. You might then think that what I want to know what my relative would actually do as a matter of fact, not what they would be likely to do based on sort of data about their past lives. People do sometimes also change. In some ways, people tend to stay the same, but they also sort of sometimes change in different directions. And maybe you have an AI model that changes in a kind of predictable direction based on what's likely, so to speak, but the real person may have gone off in a different direction. And so if one has the view that what is valuable about human relationships is what people actually do and what they actually think, etc., rather than what they're likely to do, what they're likely to think, you might worry that this idea that, okay, now we're going to have an AI model that's going to predict what the person would be likely to do, treats the person not as an agent, but as a predictable sort of, I don't know, schema or pattern or something like that. I mean, there's a long-standing tradition in philosophy of sort of celebrating or worrying about the fact that we're agents. And so Sartre, for example, thought that we should worry about the fact that we are free. This is a stressor. Sort of, he thought that we're afraid of our own free will. It's comforting to think that we're not really agents and we have to do certain things. Philip Pettit has an interesting discussion where he sort of turns things around. He says we're actually afraid of other people's free will. And so we know that our loved ones could choose to leave us or to break up or divorce us or to go and join a cult or whatever it might be. And so we're hoping, so to speak, that the bonds of love and friendship are going to sort of, tempt them, or make them resist the temptation to join that cult or to do whatever it might be. So, but they can do it because they can act unexpectedly and they can make those decisions. And so we shouldn't think of each other as sort of predictable patterns of behavior. We should think of ourselves as agents. And this goes back, of course, also to the responsibility issue that we talked about before. Because we do choose and because of our actual choices, we are responsible or not for what happens or what doesn't happen.
And unless you're of the externalism school and believe that there is no such thing as free will and everything's predetermined and everything else really. But no, and it's interesting, and you're talking about whether people's actions are predictable or not, and it almost sounds, and it's not what you're saying, it almost sounds that in a way the AI version of ourselves is more accurate than we are to ourselves in a way. And there was a famous the famous Stanford prison experiment in the 70s where, I think it was 24 people were sort of split into guards and prisoners, and beforehand everybody was very, very amenable and very, very quickly it turned into a real sort of power imbalance thing that people really hadn't expected to find, but people's predictable nature perhaps wasn't as predictable as might have been thought. But something else you said there about can we only have a relationship, or the nature of our relationship with our partner, our loved ones, changes as somebody passes away. And I was thinking about the relationship a lot of people have with their God or with religion. That they would absolutely define that as a meaningful relationship, but they've never met this entity, being, person in real life. It's a relationship based on faith and lots of other things. So relationships are very are very, very complex. And part of me, and this is not necessarily a question, but part of me does fear that AI is almost stepping into the realms of God or spiritual, or it becomes something more than it is. Is that And that's, I guess, maybe probably not your field, but it just feels that it's sort of a lot of things that people are projecting onto AI, a lot of things are expected from AI. It feels almost like we're doing it with some form of faith more. And I'm not really sure what the question is there, but does that sort of jumbled mess of words make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm fascinated by the fact that the theology faculty at my university has almost more people who are interested in the ethics of AI than the philosophy faculty. I mean, I say almost because it might not be true, but it's just that a lot of the colleagues there in theology, they're extremely fascinated and also worried about AI for exactly this reason, that they have long studied and valued and cherished the sort of in their case, I mean, this is a sort of Protestant and Catholic theology, sort of a Christian worldview. God is always there. You can talk with God and reliably, and like, you know, if your friends and family are sleeping or on the other side of the world, you know, you can talk with God, etc. Whatever that means, you know, in different interpretations. And maybe God is always on your side or something like that. And so in a certain sense here, you know, you have the chatbot that steps in here. And actually, in this case, you get a response. I mean, some people say that they're talking directly with God and God responds. But a lot of people admit that when I pray, etc., I don't get a sort of a physical response. I mean, maybe I get a sign. Maybe a bird flies by and there are bird droppings on my shoulder or something like that. You know, there are all these traditional ideas about, you know, signs from God, so to speak. The Romans, they were big time into, like, if a dead bird falls on your head, or if there are bird droppings on your head or your shoulder, that means all sorts of things. But anyways, so back to the idea that yes, and so on the one, and so you also have the idea of the all-knowing entity that sort of knows everything. Here the AI again steps in, obviously with the occasional hallucination, etc. So, but still, yes, I mean the role performed by the deities of different sorts is now either sort of by accident, because maybe some of the people who work for the tech companies didn't intend this. Other people say, who criticize them, are using sort of quasi-religious language. They talk about super intelligence, similar to supernatural phenomena, etc. They're talking about, you know, a new type of being, etc., and a new type of alien intelligence, etc., etc. And also, not only that, you know, if you go to OpenAI and DeepMind's web pages and look at the vision that they present, they say this is going to be, on the one hand, more intelligent and smarter than humans, and on the other hand, also beneficial to all of humanity. Which, you know, obviously, maybe some of the people who wrote those marketing texts were not necessarily meaning to invoke sort of religious imagery, but some of their critics say, well, you're presenting something that sounds like the new religion, like here, like, you know, there's a force that is greater than us, that's going to take care of us, that's going to be beneficial to all of humanity. And again, people from theology, they sort of almost worry that, okay, well, people are going to turn away from traditional religions towards this new religion and this new worldview, etc. And then, I mean, turning things around, of course, you can imagine people saying, well, actually here we actually have a technology that is all-knowing to some extent, and that is there for you, and that responds, and so actually provides a lot of the benefits that maybe the religion was supposed to deliver, but actually doing it. And so this would be sort of an atheist response to, okay, we need something like religion. Actual religion didn't deliver. And now, however, we have super intelligent or artificially generally intelligent AI that does deliver. This would be sort of the very optimistic. I mean, some people that are part of sort of the transhumanist school of thought. Mm-hmm. This is how they think about it. They don't like being told that they are a new kind of religion. Well, with the exception, there's something called the Mormon transhumanist, organization. I think that is a sort of a Christian, a Mormon type of transhumanism. But the average transhumanist would say, no, this is a secular, scientific, technological worldview, and we believe in AI. We don't believe in God. We're building our God, so to speak, and it's not a God; it's a technology. But it's going to be smarter than humans. It's going to be delivering the goods. It's going to, allow us to live forever and go to other planets and other dimensions, etc. So, I mean, I don't want to go too far down that path, but still, I mean, you do get these discussions, and indeed, as I said, some of the time people study theology worry more about those kinds of questions than maybe people who study the ethics of this in a philosophy context. I mean, maybe rightly or wrongly, maybe we should worry more about this and etc. But I don't know. But that's definitely a fascinating development. That I mean, actually, at my university, we have something called the AI Hub, and this is a sort of a collaboration on AI. And it turns out that all faculties of the university have people studying AI. I mentioned theology. I mean, I'm in the philosophy faculty, obviously computer science, etc. But economics, art history, and every possible field you can imagine, you have people thinking about AI, either the opportunities that it provides, or worrying about the risks and the possible bad sides of AI, and what it means for education, what it means for the future of humanity, to be a little bit more dramatic, maybe, and I mean, to maybe mention one more idea from my book that I am thinking about sort of it's more, and I want to think more about, is what I call the AI wager. We are sort of collectively now betting on AI to solve a lot of our problems and to provide benefits. At the same time, most people, including AI enthusiasts, recognize that there are great risks. Some people are more dramatic about this. They say that yes, AI actually poses existential threats to humanity, the future of humanity. Other people say, well, okay, so that's maybe a little excessive, but definitely there are risks related to misinformation, hallucinations in AI systems, people maybe becoming lazy, people not learning as much as you would hope them to do, and so all sorts of things. And so you have all sorts of risks. And yet we are pushing ahead with AI, and a lot of people have some sort of mix of sort of excitement and concern. They say, okay, let's try this and let's hope for the best, but maybe pushing ahead a little bit too quickly, maybe with too much enthusiasm, and not maybe being careful enough. Going back to the responsibility issue, are we?
Yeah.
And you can compare it with driving a car. I mean, so if you're driving a regular car and you're wearing a seatbelt, you're following all the traffic rules and regulations, you're being attentive and considerate of other people on the road and pedestrians, etc., then maybe you're a responsible driver. You're not driving too fast. It might take a little longer to get to your final destination, but you are being a careful driver, a responsible driver. Now, is that the way that AI development is sort of happening at the moment, or is it is the model of the responsible driver the right image? Well, probably not. I mean, it's rather like driving without your seatbelt, maybe while intoxicated, and trying to get to your destination as quickly as possible, while disregarding traffic rules and regulations, and maybe not being sufficiently careful with the lives and limbs of other people. So that might be a better image of the way that AI development is happening at the moment, that it's more like reckless driving, that it's more like this sort of the drunk driver that is not being careful enough, and let's hope for the best, and there might be accidents and that are preventable, and so yeah, I mean, I do think that even if you're an AI optimist, there's a choice between being a sort of a cautious and careful and responsible AI optimist on the one hand, and being a reckless and not very cautious AI optimist on the other. And I think I do worry that society as a whole is pushing ahead a little bit too quickly and not reflecting enough, and maybe also then AI is treated as this one thing. It's what is offered by, let's say, OpenAI and Anthropic and Google, but AI could be many things. Even those, I mean, these days a lot of people sort of equate AI with large language models and generative AI and chatbots, but that's one type of AI, not the only one. And also the language models could operate slightly differently, and there's a sort of wider range of possibilities here than what we usually, I think about. and we could also proceed in a more careful and deliberate and intentional way than maybe we are. I think that a lot of big tech companies, they feel like, okay, the other company now came out with a new model, and so we also have to come out with a new model as quickly as possible. And maybe just to make one more comment about how this involves certain recklessness. I mean, one, I think, pretty sad news story the other day, at least in the German media, but maybe also internationally, was about these companies that sort of go to used bookstores and buy like antique books, and then they scan them and then immediately just destroy these books so that they can train AI models with ever more data. Because the big AI companies, they've already used up all the data that's online, so their AI has already sort of read the whole internet, so to speak. And now, in order to get more data, you have to go to like sort of old books that are maybe not digitalized. And then instead of sort of carefully treating these books and putting them back where they belong in a library, museum, whatever, they just trash them or like shred them when they're done. Partly as a way of sort of denying that, well, maybe that they had access to that particular book or whatever. But it just shows, I think, a sort of reckless mentality. Like a lot of people, even if they don't care about a certain, like an old book about some topic that I am totally uninterested in, a lot of us have a sort of almost like those people that do this might say that this is irrational, but a kind of almost like a reverence, a sense that this is
absolutely,
it's an object that has a certain historical significance and meaning, and you just don't throw away those kinds of things for short-term gain. You treat these kinds of objects with respect and care, and that doesn't mean that you can't study them and that you can't extract information from them, but ideally you should do so in a way that isn't so nihilistic, so to speak, as what was described in some of those recent newspaper stories.
And I think one of the clever things that the big AI companies have done, and almost without saying it, in a way, they've said, don't worry, because AI will find a way to cure cancer, AI will solve climate change or whatever, so therefore you really should let us push ahead. And it's almost very ironic that at the moment, AI data centers are draining the environment of water, of power, of all those sort of things. So, but there's this sort of thing that you've got to let us. If you don't let us go at this speed, cancer will be cured sort of 10 years later, or we won't cure climate change. Okay, and we sort of hold back really. But so just going back to your book. So when you wrote the book, The Ethics of AI: A Philosophical Introduction, what was it that? Because it's a very big topic, and it's almost, yes, you made life quite hard for yourself. But what was it that you wanted the book to convey that perhaps other books hadn't?
Well, I can start with what I was trying to do, and then the question is whether other books do that or not. It's a further question. The subtitle, like a philosophical introduction, was really the key bit here. So I was trying to focus on topics within the ethics of AI that are specifically interesting from a sort of philosophical point of view, where this just means that the sorts of things that philosophers have traditionally been interested in. How do those kinds of questions relate to current topics within the ethics of AI? And so we have already talked about some of these topics. For example, human responsibility, free will, meaning in life. What is it to lead a good human life, and what do we mean by intelligence to begin with? What is it to be an agent that can make decisions? When do we deserve credit and recognition on the one hand? When do maybe we deserve criticism and blame, or maybe even to be punished on the other hand? So those kinds of traditional philosophical questions, and what is a good relationship, and what does it mean to exist over time as a person, etc. That's what I wanted to focus on and really bring to the forefront, as opposed to things such as concrete policy making and maybe sociological or economic questions about AI, political questions. And so if you think about politics, then maybe you have to think about compromises. We discussed before this case of like a hiring committee that they settle on a particular candidate as a compromise. You have the same thing in political decision making. Very often, candidates, they present themselves as having a certain agenda, then they come into power, and it's not necessarily that they change their values, but they have to compromise because they just can't get the rest of the government and the other parties, etc., to agree. And so the types of legislation that can be passed and the kinds of policy that can be made, that's always going to be a kind of compromise. Now, if you think about philosophy and ethics, yes, there are compromises that you should do in a certain sense, but on the other hand, there's another kind of freedom to explore views, not in a political, compromising kind of way, but to really think about, each person, of course, might come from different starting points, but if this is your starting point, I mean, how could you develop your view? What would be the most developed version of this perspective? If you come from that other starting point, what would be the best developed version of that view? How do they compare, etc.? So some of the compromises and some of the meddling that's part of politics that don't have to be part of philosophical discussion about the ethics of AI. In economical terms, you might say that, well, companies are not going to be willing to do this and that, and so the best we can hope for is that we can incentivize them to behave in this and that way. That's all interesting and very important for real-world decision-making, but it doesn't necessarily settle from an ethical or philosophical point of view what would be the right way to go for an AI company or for a person with a lot of resources or whatever. So I was specifically interested in these sort of more philosophical basic questions. Now, there are lots of books about the ethics of AI, but they're not super many books, I think, that maybe have this particular angle. I mean, so there are a few, and I talk about those other books in my book, etc. And yeah, I mean, actually, the ethics of AI as a field is an interesting one because people are coming at it from very different directions. I mentioned theology just a moment ago. There's also people coming from computer science. And so I talk a lot with colleagues from that field. What they are interested in is typically quite different than what a philosopher is interested in. They will tend to want to formalize things. They are pretty obsessed with the idea of formalizing fairness and trying to come up with different fairness metrics and measurements. And so they are interested in other topics. And so, yeah, what I was trying to do is to really kind of go for those kinds of topics that philosophers tend to find really interesting, and then hoping that, well, first of all, other philosophers would agree with me that I've picked topics that are interesting, and then also maybe sort of that students and also, I mean, people who are not philosophers would also find it interesting, but I specifically set out to sort of discuss what I think are philosophically interesting questions about the ethics of AI. Which raises the question, well, what do you mean by philosophy, obviously, but...
Yes, I guess that's a whole other podcast.
Yep.
But just, and I'm very sensitive of your time, so I don't want to take too much longer. But maybe just two more quick questions, if that's okay. So one would be, and maybe there's some slight irony in this, but are you finding challenges with the way some of your students are using AI in their academic pursuits, or are you finding people are still relatively sort of purist? Is AI becoming more and more of a challenge in higher education and how it's used?
I think it's definitely becoming a challenge. I'm happy to see that students are quite diverse in their views about AI and AI use.
Yeah.
I think there is also constant development. I mean, there are these surveys in America, young and also not just young, but people in general are much more pessimistic and negative about AI. I mean, you mentioned data centers before, yes. Partly because of those kinds of concerns, environmental concerns, also because they feel that the big tech companies have too much influence and power and are making decisions that are perceived as being in their own financial interest and maybe not. I mean, they say we're creating technologies that are supposed to be good for all of humanity, but a lot of people are worrying that this is not obviously true. And the people in decision-making positions in these companies are maybe not the people who come across as trying to benefit all of humanity, etc. So anyway, in general, people are starting to be more skeptical about AI, which might have good effects or might have bad effects. And students also, obviously they're using more and more AI. They are getting better at understanding what sort of outputs AI tends to create. And so actually, just to give you an anecdotal example of that, so there was a AI imitation of Daniel Dennett, the DigiDan AI bot that was created about 4 or 3 years ago, and that creates sort of answers in the style of the philosopher Daniel Dennett. And then the real Daniel Dennett, before he died, participated in an experiment, and so they asked him 10 questions, and they asked DigiDan 10 questions, and then people were asked to assess the answers and try to say which one came from the chatbot DigiDan and which one came from the real Dan Dennett. And my students, I've done this with them a couple of times. In the beginning, they usually would not get it right. They couldn't tell. These days, however, students are quite good to detect AI. They know what the signs are, and so they now pretty reliably can recognize which one came from the DigiDan, the chatbot, versus which outputs came from the real Dan Dennett. Whereas they didn't used to be good at this, and so they become more sophisticated in terms of being able to recognize AI outputs. At the same time, there is a lot of variation among the students in terms of how much they understand things such as AI bias, hallucinations, the possibility of misinformation, and et cetera, et cetera. So, or just knowledge about how these models work, what they do, and how their outputs are selected, etc. So you have some people who are really sophisticated, and some people who are more naive about this. So you get a lot of variety in how students view AI, and also the extent to which they use it, for what they use it, and how they use it. And so, it is a little annoying when you work in higher education, because every student essay now is a Turing test, basically. You're trying to determine, was this written by a human or generated partly by AI? Which bits of the paper is actually reflects the students' knowledge and their capabilities and skills, etc. Which would justify assigning a good or a bad grade, and which parts of the essay are not really reflecting the students' state of knowledge or what they are able to do, and whereby, strictly speaking, why would I assign a grade to a student if the student actually outsourced the production of this assignment to either another student, a paper mill, or AI? And so, traditionally, if I asked my parents to do my homework for me, and I present that as my own, and my teachers find out, they would say, well, actually, we can grade your parents and see how well they're doing. And these days, people are grading AI. That they're saying, AI has now reached PhD level and this and that. But that's a test of the capability, or the outputs produced by the AI. It doesn't necessarily reflect. So actually, to go back to my book, which I'm promoting a little bit at the moment, I discuss throughout the book this case of AlphaGo, which I found fascinating. This was 10 years ago now, and people might say it's old news, but it's still fascinating. And so this was, of course, the case where AlphaGo, the AI program, had been trained to develop Go playing strategies, and it was a program that suggested moves in the game. It was not a robot with arms and hands that could sort of place the stones on the board. A human robot was needed for that, so to speak. So a guy working for Google DeepMind would take the recommendations from AlphaGo and then put the stones on the Go board. And I don't really know the terminology. I think they're called stones, but let's say that the pieces are called stones.
Yeah, I think so.
And so he acted on the advice or the recommendations of the AlphaGo program, and he carried out. So he went through the motions of playing Go, but no one would say that he's the new world champion. No one would say that guy is such a great Go player. Wow, what an intelligent guy. In fact, you could imagine a scenario where he just doesn't even understand Go. Maybe I don't understand Go, and maybe I could understand the instructions from AlphaGo. And so I could put the stones on the board. I could beat Lee Sedol, the world champion. But no one would say that, yeah, I'm good at Go and I really deserve recognition and credit. And in the same way, the more you have your LLM do your work as a student, the more you like the guy in the AlphaGo case. You don't have to understand anything. You don't have to do anything maybe, and you don't deserve credit. Of course, if the guy in the AlphaGo case would sometimes decide to use AlphaGo's recommendations, sometimes decide not to, then you would have quite a different situation. So and harder to assess. And in the same way, of course, with students, they don't always just take whatever ChatGPT or Claude or whatever it might be recommends. They sometimes, I say sometimes, sometimes you don't know. They sometimes think about it and they make their own decisions, and so it just makes it more difficult because you're sort of. It's usually not either or. So either they write the paper altogether by themselves, or they use generative AI to sort of generate the whole thing. There are some people who do that, and there are still some people who write everything themselves. I myself am old school. I write all my things without generative AI. But a lot of people, of course, fall in between those two extremes. They use generative AI to produce text, to write papers, to come up with ideas. But they also think themselves, etc. So it just creates a kind of a headache because, as an educator, you don't know what they've learned, you don't know what grade they deserve, you don't know whether they're ready for the next level, etc. So the short answer is yes. This is it's a difficult problem, and it's fascinating philosophically. So it's really good for people such as myself who work on the ethics of AI.
Yes.
But on the other hand, in in one's role as a sort of educator and teacher, and someone has to assign grades, it's suddenly a real world problem that is really annoying to have to deal with.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody that marks they sort of mark graduate papers, and they were saying one of the things they found is they have to spend a lot more time checking the references because AI hallucinates beautifully. Professor Sven Nyholm in his paper, The Dog Ate My Homework, said, you've never written a paper called that, but they have the date, they have the topic, they have everything. It's beautifully sourced. Yeah, but this thing never existed at all, really.
Absolutely. The funny thing is that has happened to me quite a few times that indeed that they have hallucinated papers that I've supposed to have written, where you might have thought that at least they should check whether the teacher has actually.
So bad, isn't it?
Yeah, and so it gets also.
Check that check your teacher's written the paper you're saying they've written. That'd be number one on my list.
It's embarrassing for everyone involved. It's.
Yeah. It was interesting with AlphaGo though. I remember at the time they're saying that one of the things, almost counterintuitively in a way, was that the moves that a lot of time music was suggesting were moves that a human would never have made. So almost you think it's meant to predict what's next, but actually it was predicting something very different, really. But it's a bit like the Chinese room experiment, I guess. That you might believe that what's coming out of that room is Chinese, but actually the person in the room never spoken a word of Chinese in their life. That's the thing. So my final question, because I'll just keep talking because I'm loving this conversation. So are you, maybe this is a bit cheeky, but are you able to give a bit of context to your next book that's coming up?
Well, sure. We've actually just done so. So then my next book that I'm working on is about AI and authorship. And let me just mention quickly before getting to that indeed I do compare the Chinese room thought experiment with the AlphaGo case in my book, and I discussed what if the guy in the Chinese room now suddenly has ChatGPT, and or what if what if the case with the AlphaGo player is like the Chinese room, that people don't know that this person is using AlphaGo, and then all of a sudden we would sort of think that he's a great Go player, and he would have, what we might call artificial human intelligence. And so you can make it seem as if you're very intelligent. And rather than doing something with the help of your intelligence, you're doing it in a different way. Well, in this case with the help of AI, whereas other people might have used their natural intelligence to write the paper to make the Go move or whatever it might be. So, but anyway, that also relates to the topic of my book that I've just started working on about AI and authorship. And so obviously, as we said, people tend to use generative AI either not at all or to completely generate text, or they fall somewhere in between those two extremes. And so Maybe they just clean up the language, the grammar. Maybe they chat with their favorite chatbot as a way of generating ideas. Maybe they say, I need this paragraph to say the following. Can you produce a draft, etc. So there are lots of different ways of using these tools, and this raises questions about: are you still the author of the output? Is the chatbot a co-author or an author, maybe even, or is there no author? So when it comes to traffic, we talk about driverless cars sometimes instead of self-driving cars. Maybe we should also talk about authorless texts. And so maybe, actually, I'm tempted towards this view myself. So if you're an author, then on the one hand, if there's some problem with your text, you're spreading misinformation, or you didn't check your references, then you might be responsible for that and subject to possible criticism. But also, if your text is good, then you are the one that would deserve credit and recognition. When it comes to AI-produced text, you may fulfill the first criterion. You might be someone who's still you're responsible. It's you should have checked. One of my favorite examples. Favorite is maybe the wrong word. There were people selling mushroom collection books on Amazon that were partly AI generated, and of course, it's quite dangerous if the AI hallucinates false information about which mushrooms are safe to eat. And indeed, that's what happened. We would be quite happy to say you should have checked this, before you tried to make money off of this book, because this is so dangerous, and so you were not being careful enough. So maybe you didn't want to poison anyone, but nevertheless you are selling a book under your own name, recommending eating these poisonous mushrooms. So you might still be negatively responsible in the sense of being subject to appropriate criticism. But let's say that AI generated mushroom book also contains some beautifully written sentences, maybe some useful information, but those also came from the AI. There you might say, well, just like the guy playing Go with the help of AlphaGo doesn't deserve to be the new world champion, you also shouldn't get the award for best author or something like that if you have AI. And indeed, there is some guy who he keeps winning short story and novel competitions, but he keeps being accused of using a generative AI. I think somewhere in the Caribbean or something like that. I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he has this sort of interesting situation. I think he's won one or two writing competitions, and he keeps getting accused of using generative AI. And so of course, he has to try to prove that I actually did write this myself, and the other people are trying to prove that no, AI did it, and so therefore you don't deserve the kind of credit that is associated with getting this kind of award. So what I'm trying to do in the book is to try to break down the different aspects of authorship, the good and the bad, so to speak, the responsibility and credit. I also talk about the value of writing and the value of formulating your own thoughts in your own words. And for a while I was tempted to just think in the following way: okay, language used to be a human affair, and that's what's distinctive about humans. Now we have chatbots that can produce language, and so now that's no longer distinctively human. But I now want to say that actually it's still distinctively human. These technologies are imitating us. They're finding patterns in our human texts, and they're reproducing those patterns, sometimes outputting great stuff, novel ideas, solving mathematical problems, whatever. But still, it's still the case that they're imitating patterns again, the AI companies that go to old books to try to find new patterns, and so it's still an expression of something deeply human, namely the use of language, and you still have this big difference that when we use language, we're expressing our thoughts and our emotions and feelings and our conscious experience and our life experience, etc. Whereas the AI chatbots and AI models are doing amazing and impressive things, but they're not. So there are people these days who are starting to take seriously the idea that these technologies are conscious, that they have thoughts, that they have emotions. But a lot of them are still admitting that these things don't have life experience, they don't interact with the world directly, they interact with their data. If they're conscious in some different way than humans, etc. So, and they use language in a different way, and they learn language by different methods and so on. So it's still going to be the case that what writing and expressing oneself in words means for a human is quite different than from a language model. And so I also think that you're sort of robbing yourself of something distinctively human when, instead of writing your own text, formulating your own thoughts in your own words, you're outsourcing this to language models and chatbots. And so part of what I want to do in my book is to sort of, to some extent, rehabilitate the value of writing and authorship and say, actually, just like chess and Go, people are still playing chess and Go, even though now we have AI technologies that can beat us at chess and Go. People in those worlds, the chess world and the Go world, they're still celebrating the game of Go and chess, the games of Go and chess, and they're still playing, they're still learning it, they're still excelling. And I think in the same way with when writing and authorship, yes, you're going to have lots of people using generative AI to produce text quickly and without too much effort. At the same time, you're also going to have, I think, and I hope, you're always going to have people who value the process of writing, that value text, and that value the idea that this is a way of expressing oneself, and that who treat authorship not just as something completely instrumental, but being recognized as the author. So let's say that people like my previous book. Actually, on the other day, someone gave it a 5 stars on Amazon. That's only one one score so far. I mean, that was quite nice. Because I did write the book myself, and so I can feel a sense of ownership and pride and whatever. If I had produced the book either partly or altogether with generative AI, actually there are sociological, psychological studies showing that people indeed, they feel less of a sense of ownership. They can not remember what the text says because they sometimes didn't actually write it, and so the sort of
read it.
Yeah, they might not have read it. Indeed, I think this happens with students sometimes because they would submit text and then there would be some of this AI language, even texts that say things like, "Sure, I'd be happy to write a paragraph on what X for you." Suggesting that the student...
That's been too lazy.
Yeah, so, not even reading the text, and so much less being able to remember it. So yeah, it's about what's an author and what are the values that we associate with writing and with authorship, not just instrumental values, but also what kind of opportunities are there to display certain kinds of virtues like creativity, good taste, or whatever it might be associated with choosing your words. What values are there associated with being recognized as the author of something? So again, if someone thinks that your texts are good, that might be, it's a special kind of recognition. If maybe your peers appreciate your work, maybe people who are not your peers, maybe your students, or maybe the general public appreciate your work, etc. You're not going to get that to the same extent, I think, maybe I'm wrong, if you sort of outsource too much of the writing to AI. You might, you mentioned Donald Trump before. He makes jokes sometimes they're quite funny. He said about the Iran war that if it goes well, I'm going to take credit. If it goes poorly, I'm going to blame J.D. Vance. And I think that's a general tendency that people have, not just Trump. We want to take credit for good things, and we want to blame others for bad things that happen. But it sometimes can be the case that I don't know if Vance or Trump deserve credit or blame for the Iran war, but it could very well be that Trump deserves the blame and then Vance would deserve the credit if things go poorly well. So what we want in terms of we want to get credit and we want to avoid blame, that's one thing. But the question of desert, when do we deserve credit and when do we deserve blame, that might go in the opposite direction. And so I'm interested in that topic in generally when it comes to AI, and then in particular when it comes to authorship, which is the topic of what I'm trying to write at the moment. So that's the next book.
We'll have to come on to talk about that, Nick, when you finish it. But it'd be interesting to talk about chess. I remember when Deep Blue beat Kasparov, everybody said that's the end of chess. But now you think about Magnus Carlsen's probably got a higher profile than any chess player in the last few decades. It's very, very popular again, and I think... But I remember during lockdown, this is very bizarre. there was a thing where I used to work that people would come in and they show the sort of the spoon that they carved, or they made things during lockdown, because we can go out and buy this thing so easily, and by the time we bought the materials, the knife, everything else, we paid far more than we would have paid for a spoon from IKEA. But there's something about that, and they've done it with brain scans that people are writing or reading, whatever. There's something that innate satisfaction of actually doing something as opposed to outsourcing it to somebody else is far outweighs that. So I do think on one hand, yes, AI is becoming sort of omnipresent, which is fabulous. But on the other hand, people are also seeking out ways that almost validate what it means to be a human. It feels that maybe that's your next book after this one, but it almost feels that how are we seeking, what does it really mean to be a human in the time of AI, really?
Absolutely. I mean, I was going to say that.
I was going to say I will let you go. I'll just keep talking otherwise. I know you've got a big exam this afternoon to help sort out. So I hope that goes very well. I look forward to reading the new book when it comes out. And please, do promise to come back and talk about it, because I know I had a long list of questions, which we probably got to about 5 of them. But it was just I really enjoyed the conversation. So no, I appreciate your time and what you're doing. So it's it was really enjoyable. So, no, thank you.
Absolutely. And let me just comment on what you said before you started running up. And indeed, this the question: what is it to be human in the age of AI? I think that's for me, that's my. I talked about earlier, like, what's specifically philosophically interesting about the ethics of AI, and that's one way of capturing it. Like, what does it mean these days to be a human being, to live a valuable and good human life, and how can we sort of. In my colleague Shannon Valerie talks about reclaiming our humanity in the age of AI, or I would say maybe also expressing our humanity in the age of AI or something like that. So anyway, that's definitely capturing, for me personally, what I'm very interested in this context. And so yeah, thanks again. I enjoyed the conversation as well, and I would certainly be happy to come back on the podcast. Either to discuss those questions that we didn't get through, or to discuss my next book whenever it comes out. So thanks for having me, and thanks a lot.
No, well, enjoy the end of the academic semester, and then enjoy the time. I say enjoy the time writing. I'm sure there'll be times where you think, why am I doing this? But at the end there's going to be an amazing output. So just take care.
All right, cheers. Thanks.